elementary bowl. Okay, and we've got, actually this is like a good group. This is fun, like maybe 20 people. This is pretty awesome. We've left some amazing music. Africa Forest Dance was giving us an amazing, energetic music send-off to decompress from our mornings of effort. But so the focus of this, and actually you guys put the right away. Maybe we'll just put these up temporarily. We're not going to leave these guys. So these are my little ladies. They're puppets, and I made them. I participated in an event with a friend in the United Kingdom called Cry of the Mothers, and it was about what was going on with the kids. And so these are full of, I'm in a habit of collecting natural things. So I have like stones and feathers and shells, and I work in a botanic garden, so I sort of have collections of these. So if you feel like we can pass the little puppies around, like you can feel that they have stuff in them, like they're full of good intentions for the kids. This one has a little bit prickly, but well, so did you make those? I did. I made them. They're just felt. They're just very basic skills, right? So yeah, so they're like they hold these intentions, right? And so I kind of feel like the mothers will come with us today to keep us company. So the other piece of this is a book that I read in elementary school. It's from the 70s, Madeline L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time. Okay, and this book is about sort of quantum physics and faith and children and love. And it's part of the series, but in the end of this, the little girl's father disappears. He's a physicist, and he ends up trapped in Camazotz. And it's based on IT. So the thing that holds it is a technocratic society, and it's IT. It's this brain, okay, that has no love in it. And so these mythical figures come and travel across like time and space, like string theory, to this other universe to save the father, and then her younger brother gets trapped by it too. And so what I did was I asked people to send me good intentions for the kids on Twitter and Facebook. And so I feel like what's coming with the human capital bond markets, which are linked to digital identity, which the Excelsior Pass, these biometric tracking systems with digital identity that are being framed as health passports, are really about getting us tracked in the spatial web, tracked in this global prison planet of this next phase of the internet. And they really want the children. They don't want us so much because like we're not really likely to be retrofit to this thing. They're just like with these people, but we really want the toddlers, we want the elementary school, because they also want them to actually code this digital jail. So they need it built. It has to be built, and it's the next form of empire. And the way I've talked about this is that, like, if you know where we were down at Battery Park, it's a military installation, right? It's a defensible installation because the people who came here, it wasn't theirs, and they took it and they're defending it, right? So we are living in a militarized empire, imperial situation. And I will just point out that the other side of this park, the Bowling Green Park, is the Native American Indian Museum, right? So if we understand empire, like this was Lenape land, Broadway was the trading route. If you look at it's a magnificent looking building. It doesn't look like it particularly represents indigenous worldviews. It's a very,
Customs.
Well, it's customs house. Well, see, there you go. So there we've got more synchronicity, right? Customs. This is international trade of both the slave people and the indigenous, right? And so I feel like what we have to do in this, and this is so tempting, is to be angry or to sort of lash out at these things. But the most powerful thing is love, and so love wins.
Amen.
I invite her energy up through me, through my center channel. And the reason that they make us stand 6 feet apart is because we have a toroidal energy flow, and it comes up our central energy channel and showers out our crown all around us. Lit up. I would like to thank the fractal of source that is in my heart. Some people talk about the higher self. I have recontextualized the higher self out of hierarchy and this feeling of separation into the center of my body. So we're each a fractal of the source consciousness, of the divine. And that fractal resides in our heart. I have made offerings throughout the day in the parks that we've been. I've made offerings to the land and said Ho'oponopono prayer. So having made offerings to these lands that we have been on today, I acknowledge the ancestors of these lands. I acknowledge the mycelium network and the quantum interconnectivity of the earth that they contain. I acknowledge the soil microbes, the trees and the plants, the land animals, the sea creatures, and birds of the air. Thank you to the elementals, and thank you to the earth fae, because if you don't acknowledge them, they may mess with you. I decree a true source light circle to protect every single one of us as we progress from site to site. May we be blessed from interference. May we be in alignment and walk with the blessing and the love of the land. Thank you for those who have given permission. I invite, with deepest respect, honor, love, and gratitude, our benevolent guides. Oh, here they are. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, whose names we know, whose names we do not know. Our benevolent ancestors. Thank you. It boggles the mind to think of how many ancestors there are right here just with this group of people. Could be thousands of our ancestors here with us right now. Thank you. So, thank you, and I invite you to these benevolent guides and benevolent ancestors to this light sphere that of source light that has been co-created here to witness our rituals, to bless us, and to magnify these energies. May Goddess, a spirit, whatever name you care to call it, accept all our energies, all our intentions, and all our love power offerings. Here, to move the energies in alignment with co-creating more justice and reducing suffering, she adds her energies and receives our offerings and sends that energy to the exact subatomic address that it needs to go in the quantum field. And she uses that energy and her energies that so we're co-creating. We move the energies in alignment with justice. We're not co-creating an ego, we're co-creating in alignment with justice for everyone. So we all, may all these energies that we move and intend be received in alignment to reduce suffering, increase justice, and align us and the entire collective with goddesses or spirits' perfect plan for global justice and planet. There should be a healing component to anything. The energies. Basically, I chant a Ho'oponopono prayer. I say, I am the violet flame. Healing energy. It takes dark, dense pain and wounds and liberates it back to the light. And basically, I did a shadow signature on the force that we're fighting. So the shadow signature is priest signature. So the priest archetype. So the structural, institutional woundedness that we're dealing with here, coming from these totalitarians. It basically says that we have been hurt as a collective by those who violated the trust of their spiritual community. And if you look around at all the heads of patriarchal religions and spiritual leaders, they're corrupt, they're sellers, they're sellouts, they're liars, they're greedy. They've totally been seduced by their own role, and they're not serving anybody's, I'm not going to overgeneralize, but there is a preponderance of this kind of woundedness structurally. So our current spiritual leadership have failed us. Pioneer this wanting of these venture capitalists and the billionaire class to do what has never been done before. But they're hurting the 99. They're hurting everybody else on the planet, in their egoic dreams. And then the very last part of this shadow signature is prostitute. And what that means is we have all been wounded by the powerful who have commoditized life and who have programmed us to actually accept this capitalist world where life is devalued over what profit it can bring the ownership. So they have commoditized life and violated the dignity and the safety of the web of life. So I am honoring, witnessing with so much compassion and so much respect with this microcosm here, our collective woundedness from priest shadow, pioneer shadow, and prostitute shadow. All the time to transmute today. But thank you. Very, very quickly. Everywhere that we have released density associated with shadow, all of us, I must absolutely refill us in with the brightest, lightest, true source healing light in the most golden, liquid, true source love light. And I seal us in. May our electric fields, electromagnetic, personal field, our etheric field, and our infinite causal fields vibrate and resonate with increased integrity and coherence. So much to be, and so it is.
I will give you the setup. So Charles Wallace is the brother who's been captured by IT, and he's not himself. He's been taken over by this mechanized system. And Meg, who's the older sister, is supposed to save him, but she's not very confident, and she doesn't know how to do it, and she feels like she has to do this thing she doesn't know how to do, right? And so they're in Camazotz, and they said that you're supposed to find something that IT doesn't have, right? And it's this artificial brain. So, directly ahead of her was the circular building, its walls glowing with violet flame, its silvery roof pulsing with a light that seemed to Meg to be insane. Again, she could feel the light, neither warm nor cold, but reaching out to touch her, pulling her toward IT. Now, what I keep talking about is AI as the endgame settler colonizer. There was a sudden sucking, and she was within, and it was as though the wind had been knocked out of her, and she gasped for breath in her own rhythm, not in the permeating pulse of IT. And she felt the inexorable beat within her body, controlling her heart and lungs. But not herself, not Meg. It did not quite have her, and she blinked her eyes rapidly and against the rhythm until the redness before them cleared and she could see. There was a brain. There was IT lying, pulsing and quivering on the dais, soft and exposed and nauseating. Charles Wallace was crouched beside IT, his eyes still slowly twirling, his jaw still slack, and as she had seen him before, with a tick in his forehead, reiterating the revolting rhythm. And she saw him, and it was again as though she had been punched in the stomach, for she had to realize afresh that she was seeing Charles, and yet it was not Charles at all. Where was Charles Wallace, her own beloved Charles Wallace? What is it that I have got that IT hasn't got? You have nothing that IT hasn't got, Charles Wallace said coldly. How nice to have you back, dear sister. We have been waiting for you. We knew that Mrs. Whatsit would send you. She is our friend, you know. And for an appalling moment, Meg believed it. And in that moment, she felt her brain being gathered up into IT. No, she screamed at the top of her lungs. No, you lie. And for a moment, she was free from IT's clutches again. For as long as I can stay angry enough, IT can't get me. Is that what I have that IT doesn't have? Nonsense, said Charles Wallace. You have nothing that IT doesn't have. You're lying, she replied, and she felt only anger towards this boy who was not Charles Wallace at all. No, it was not anger, it was loathing, it was hatred. It was sheer unadulterated, and she became lost in hatred, and she began to be lost in IT, and the red miasma swam before her eyes. Her stomach churned in its IT rhythm, and her body trembled with the strength of her hatred and the strength of IT. And with the last vestige of consciousness, she jerked her mind and body. Hate was nothing that IT didn't have. IT knew all about hate. You are lying about that, and you are lying about Mrs. Whatsit, she screamed. Mrs. Whatsit hates you, Charles Wallace said. And that is where IT made IT's fatal mistake. For as Meg said automatically, Mrs. Whatsit loves me, that's what she told me, that she loves me. And suddenly she knew. Love. That was what she had that IT did not have. She had Mrs. Whatsit's love, and her father's and her mother's, and the real Charles Wallace's love, and the twins, and Aunt Beast, and she had love for them. But how could she use it? What was she meant to do? If she could give love to IT, perhaps it would shrivel up and die? For she was sure that IT could not withstand love. But she, in all of her weakness and foolishness and baseness and nothingness, was incapable of loving IT. Perhaps it was not too much to ask of her, but she couldn't do it. But she could love Charles Wallace, and she could stand there and love, and she could love Charles Wallace, her own Charles Wallace, the real Charles Wallace, the child for whom she had come back to Camazotz, to IT, the baby who was so much more than she was, and yet who was utterly vulnerable. She could love Charles Wallace. Charles, I love you, my baby brother who always takes care of me. Come back, come back. Come away from IT, come back, come home. I love you, Charles. Oh, Charles, I love you. And tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she was unaware of them. And now she was even able to look at him, at this animated thing that was not her own Charles Wallace at all, and she was able to look and to love. I love you, Charles Wallace. You are my darling and my dear and the light of my life and the treasure of my heart. I love you, I love you, I love you. And slowly his mouth closed, and slowly his eyes stopped twirling, and the tick in the forehead ceased its revolting twitch, and he advanced towards her. I love you, she cried. I love you, Charles, I love you. And then suddenly he was running, pelting. He was in her arms, and he was shrieking with sobs. Meg, Meg, Meg. I love you, Charles, she cried, her sobs almost as loud as his, her tears mingling with his. I love you, I love you, I love you. It seems like we're actually going to probably be dealing more with the back end of this bowl because I don't see us. It's actually pretty appropriate. Yeah. Right? So we have this garland that we created. Actually, Marianne braided it last night. We went up to City College. Dandelion, which is a liver cleanse for anger, and it has mugwort, which is sort of mystical dreams, and then we have plantain, which is a sort of a settler colonizer plant, but it's good for inflammation, and Star of Bethlehem, which is good for improved heart function. So actually, and we did not know any of these plant beings were necessarily going to find their way into our project, and they just presented themselves perfectly to the project. The bowl is Minotaur, in my view, and we're fighting the Minotaur. And this summer of dandelion healing and mending, Hecate fed Theseus for 30 days on dandelion before he fought the Minotaur. And so there's a sense of like also the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Like Daedalus and Icarus built the labyrinth to hold the Minotaur, and Ariadne provided him a sword and string to find the way back out. And for that, and I think Daedalus gave it to Ariadne, so they were imprisoned in the labyrinth, right? And then they got out with the wings, but Icarus was not supposed to fly too close to the sun. Right. And he did, and then he fell in the ocean. So I think when we think about these synchronicities, right, like the web, the spatial web, Ariadne, the thread, we have the Minotaur that's eating children, right? That's Wall Street eating children. And then we have these craftsmen that are, have these ambitions, right, that don't work out, right? They do, the Icarus, it was overreach, right? And it falls apart, but we have to do our part to help to hold the line until that moment comes. So I think as we, maybe what we can do is we can put the little mothers next to the back leg, because I really don't want, I'm trying not to be aggressive like we're doing like loving things. And really the back end is probably the more appropriate end to deal with. Actually, and then we'll put the mothers down, we'll wrap the garland around the back foot. I'll put the book down, and then if you have dandelion or rose petals, you can sprinkle them around, and then we'll move on to the stock exchange. The little dollies, the puppets. We're gonna there are witnesses. Yeah, we'll just put the mothers here so that they can like witness.
It's perfect.
This is on behalf of the children, and I'm going to read 2 of these. They're short. There will always be something inside of you that is utterly inviolate, and this part of you is capable of alchemizing anything back to love again. Tend to it and teach others to do the same. So that is quite beautiful. And then may the dark energies on our earth plane, rooted in fear and control, be released into the fire. And may the light of the highest order surround us and amplify our sovereignty. So I think, and then love wins. Love wins is sort of the central. If you have any,
are the dolls going to go closer, or are they going to stay
I think
there?
they're going to witness, because I'm going to take them with us, and we'll have the panopticon. We'll have the panopticon too. It's the little. We have the star acorn. This is from my friend Lynn, and it's from Bolivia. And we're going to leave one at each of the spots that has a star. We'll stand it right in there. Yeah. And then it's in the seed. I'm going to put some dandelion tincture. Are you going to make the offering? You did? Did you do that? Okay. All right. That's pretty appropriate. Wonderful fresh dandelion greens that Pat saved for us for this occasion. the stream water from upstate. Before we go on, because we're going to use this to cleanse some of the threshold. We just came, back from the Wall Street Bowl, and it's interesting because actually there's a gentleman, he does geomancy work in Philadelphia. His name is Roz Ben. He's a very interesting guy. He does amazing research, and he talks about how the public art tells the story. So some of these things they talk about, like they tell you what they're planning, and the tales are told in the public art and architecture of the city. So we're in Philly, and essentially his hypothesis was that Ben Franklin was the Philadelphia. He interpreted art landmarks along the Ben Franklin Parkway. The thing about Philadelphia is Ben Franklin, like the University of Pennsylvania is his university, and they're doing the first human CRISPR trials. They're setting up impact investing. They're doing all the gene therapies. There's a lot of aspects of Philadelphia where, like, if there was sort of a demonic sense, like it could easily be coming from ideally University of Penn would be part of that. But so I'm here because it's another statue. So we just came back from the bull, and this is the fearless girl. And her position earlier, like originally, was in facing down the bull, and it was sort of this whole narrative of like, look at the little girl. It's like women power facing the bull of Wall Street, and she's so fearless. But what you realize is once you get into the impact investing space, the ESG, environmental social governance space, gender equity is goal number 5. Okay, and what happens with these sustainable development goals is they're all about impact, right? And I put impact in air quotes. Impact is data surveillance. Impact is turning lives and social relations onto a dashboard and engineering them in very narrow ways. So you could say, like, look, we improved it, right? And so girls are a huge target of these social impact bonds. Now, do the impact, this was sponsored by State Street Global Advisors, right? So if you know the story of the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 5 and girls, and also controlling women on dashboards, and then putting out this narrative that this is about women empowerment, it's a very different framing, right? Because what these global investors most want is to actually harness young women of the global south into their predatory microfinance schemes to code girls in STEM, to code the virtual world, to set up the digital jail. And the first development impact bond was around education for girls in India. All right, like the World Bank isn't setting up, and it's all tech and it's all STEM, which is all military. They're not setting this all up so that they can empower girls, but they'll have like this whole thing. And like you remember the news cycle around the statue a number of years ago, all over like, oh, it's about women and girls and Wall Street, and isn't this like this wonderful story? Who's paying for it? Like it's always follow the money, and then understand their motivation. So anyway, we can like just finish this off here, and we're going to go up to federal halls and talk about this stuff a little bit more. But if you don't know the backstory, right, they're contriving certain narratives to suck people in because most people are good. Like most people are not terrible. Most people don't want bad things to happen to children. Like they have families, but they're trying to navigate the world, taking care of their own families and live and survive, and then they want feel-good stories. And so these structures know how to manipulate people into something where they're like, oh, we didn't tell you, by the way, we're signing up the girls for digital slavery and putting them on a dashboard for the UN, so the Impact Management Project can like make bank on that. They're not going to tell you that. So like I have to tell you that. But I told you.
And we thank you for that.
Sitting on the steps of the House of Morgan. This is J.P. Morgan Chase. Okay? So we're opposite the New York Stock Exchange. And so the history lesson here is that J.P. Morgan Chase is actually today working in the social impact bond space around early college and community college funding. And so my background is in education. It's not the health space, right? And so I was tracking what was going on with putting children on blockchain, and that was piloted by Southern New Hampshire University, which has a huge online education component, and they're working with Google. But they piloted a blockchain transcript with MIT's spin-out called Learning Machine. So Learning Machine is also setting up blockchain transcripts in Tulsa, and then there's something called, I believe it's green light credential blockchain in Texas. And it's part of something called the Dallas County Promise. And so they're setting it up, again, because clearly paying for 4-year education is horrendously expensive and puts a lot of people in debt. So what they're saying is, great, we'll have all of the kids in high school, like when they're a junior, start taking community college classes, and then you'll graduate with an associate's, which on the one hand sounds great from a financial standpoint, but on the other hand, why are we rushing 18-year-olds into a gig economy job market and like stealing them of actual time to learn and develop developmentally? Because how many people really think a 16 and 17-year-old kid is doing college level work, like that level work? And I'm not trying to be elitist about it, but they're framing their solution in a way that actually miseducates more kids and puts them into a workforce where they are more vulnerable, because this workforce they're planning is the fourth industrial revolution, where they're like, well, nobody's getting a job unless your metadata says you're in alignment with the government interest, and we decide that the AI, you qualify for this gig temporary work. And that's the future they're feeding these kids into, and they're not being legit. They're pretending to parents like it's still the same old economy, and it's not. They're building an ever more brutal globalized economy. So these blockchain programs are also likely going to connect to income sharing agreements, where you garnish your future wages by signing contracts, and then they're going to securitize that debt that's being done out of Purdue, and then they're going to create giant derivatives markets in that debt and trade it on global platforms tied to entities. Okay, so Dallas County Promise sounds really good. If you're like, oh, we want low-income kids to get an associate's degree. Okay, but the hitch is that you get your transcript on blockchain, which means now you have a blockchain identity, so that you're queued up to compete in the badge-based micro-credential global gig economy space. And that's the truth of it. So the thing is, the backstory on JP Morgan is that his money was in railroads. So we have to understand that the broadband, the telecom infrastructure, the cloud world is, railroads were the tool of empire. They were the tool of manifest destiny, of conquering indigenous land and bringing in labor to take over, like, the territories, right? And to expand across the continent. That's what the railroads did, and they were often companies that fronted that for the government, and then the military came in and backed the corporate governments of the railroads to get that land, often which was like promised to, veterans and things to take indigenous land. So it was this corporate, public-private partnership, right, where the government paid our military to defend these corporate interests. So if you understand that the cloud and the blockchain and the broadband are the equivalent of the railroads, it makes a lot of sense what is happening now, right? And what is happening in the spatial web and blockchain is like we're being trapped up in this new imperial project that's being built around us in ways that are kind of invisible and people don't understand. So U.S. Steel, which was also JP Morgan, had the commodities to build the railroad tracks. Well, to get steel, you needed coal to have the heat. So they had the coal too, and they were very involved in suppressing the labor movement, like radical labor movements, because these programs were terribly oppressive. At one point, U.S. Steel bought the Tennessee Steel, Coal, and Railroad Company, which was in Tennessee and northern Alabama, and there were mines called the Pratt Mines, where essentially they would scoop up black people off the street and say, you're a vagrant, we'll send you to court, oh, you can't pay the money, we'll throw you in the mine. And they worked those people to death. They worked them to death. And it's the same money that built this building. And it's the same money that's going to put these kids on blockchain and do it all over again. And so there's this separation of history that goes with it that is really important. So one of the things I want to do today is to put an energetic imprint on these, the built environment that represents these domination systems of power. And then the other piece, what's behind me, is Federal Hall. And so, there are parts of the history that you don't get told. And one book that really influenced me is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book Loaded about the Second Amendment. But part of that was a section about the Revolutionary War that I was never familiar with, which was that the British government had set a line of the Appalachians to say, you don't go over there. That's Indian land. You just stay on this side. Okay? There were many of the founding fathers were land speculators, including Jefferson, Washington, who were surveyors. And they went over across the line and they started figuring out what they wanted. Okay? So a lot of the revolutionary liberation was actually about, I'm not saying Great Britain was great. They were like, we're busy fighting in India and building an empire here. Can you just behave and stay on your side of the mountain? And over here, I'm going to get some stuff. So that's what Washington was about, right? And I said in Philly, when he was inaugurated, his first house, the house of the president, was in Philadelphia. He was writing to say, how can I keep my slaves? We were a city of free blacks. So he's like, how do I keep my slaves? If I come here to Philadelphia, are they what are the rules? and I send them back to Mount Vernon, whatever. And so when we talk about, like, we have this set of history, we have this understanding of it, but it's not full understanding, right? So these are the people, and many of them were also Freemasons, so that's added to the thing too, right? So he's a surveyor, he's a land speculator. Next to this building is this is the Trump building. And when I was looking on Google Maps, when I zoomed in, it said the Native Venture Capital Fund is in that building. So the Native Venture Capital Fund, often there are shell companies through military contracts and other government contracts that are covered, right? Like, I mean, there are some indigenous people, but they're not really fully indigenous, but that get these contracting systems. They're also working in opportunity zones. So these opportunity zones, the promise zones, are ways of laundering global finance into totally dispossessing and gentrifying low-income communities all over the country, communities of color, communities that have ties to indigenous people, and it's being framed as liberation, but these opportunity zones are going to be smart city gulags, right? They're going to be the new reservations, right? Because you've got Trump, you've got that land speculator real estate there, we've got the founding father real estate, and then we're all in empire where it is the powerful preying on people who are vulnerable, who don't even know the game they're in, right? They're just living day to day, and they're trying to figure out what they're doing, and they don't have the headspace, the bandwidth to absorb all of this. And then even if they did, what do they do about it? What are we supposed to do about it? So in my little framing, like I've sent my dandelions, and I have people have been sending me these amazing dandelions. I can't remember where this one comes from. This is a beautiful specimen. It looks like a medieval botanical. Trust me, it's in here. Press. And someone sent me one from the Rheinfall in Switzerland. And there's one in here, there's a Swiss postcard, okay? So I think that given the Swiss central banking system, that it's very appropriate they're going to leave these two gifties here for the House of Morgan. And I want to scrub the step with someone from the UK sent me this lovely soap. And I actually knit this little wash rag. So I'm going to use some of the water that we gathered from the Hudson and upstate to put an energetic imprint on this building and somewhere over there on that building, to sort of contest this history. And I also have some dandelions. My friend Grace, who's a quantum nurse RN in New Jersey, she said that they're a little damp, so they were evidently preyed on by a shaman. So they're sacred, slightly moldy dandelions, but we'll leave some of those for them as well. And then I will also say, so this is what I'm going to leave with Washington, and you guys know more about sacred geometry probably understand this better. This is a woman from upstate New York who sent me this box, and it has these lovely geometric pattern on it, and on the inside it has lovely dandelions and wood. She spends a lot of time on Lake Onondaga, okay, which is sacred land, and she sent me a freshwater shell and feathers from the lake here. And so, yeah, we want to pass it around. And so I want to leave this at Washington, and it's dominating power. So lately, I have been in touch with Stephen Newcomb, who I mentioned in my talk today. He wrote this book called Pagans in the Promised Land, and he has spent his life, I believe, Lenape and Shawnee ancestry, of studying the legal underpinnings of domination that goes back to the Bible, studying them in Latin, going to Europe, looking at the original documents. A lot of this is right out in the open if somebody stopped to read it. Right? They count on nobody's going to go to the library or look at the LinkedIn profile or listen to the 4-hour World Bank webinar on blockchain and find out. Or what are they going to do about it, right? We're going to do our dandelion. So I just want to read this. I have not read the whole book yet, but I said, Stephen, can I read from your book on Saturday? And he said yes. And I said, is there a particular part? And he also mentioned the Northwest Ordinance. That's something I want to mention. That was where the land was that they wanted. It was 3 to 5 states in the Ohio territory. And those wars against the Native Americans, the Miami, Ohio, were terrible and brutal. And a lot of it was asymmetrical warfare, burned crown food crops to starve out women and children. Okay? So this is how this narrative was carried out in terms of the erasure of and the takeover of those lands. And so the legislation for the Northwest Ordinance was signed here in this building. So Washington was inaugurated at Federal Hall, and then the Northwest Ordinance was also signed. So this is a significant building. Beyond, we have the stock exchange on one side, and I will say, in the human capital bond markets, the trading we are commodities. So the trading is actually more based in Chicago. Chicago is the commodities market. So not to say the stock exchange doesn't have any bearing on it, but really the commodities is more. So I'm going to read this last section from Stevens. And I only connected with him recently, but he says it better than I do. But we are on exactly the same page that this is a battle of life, and not just human life, but of all of life on planet Earth and nature and our obligation. So there is the old cliche about things getting darkest just before the dawn. The way out of the dark period in which we now find ourselves must involve a positive cognitive paradigm shift, away from the mentality and behaviors of empire and domination, reflective of the conqueror model, and the chosen people promised land model of the Old Testament, including the doctrine of Christian discovery and dominion in Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. Although it is beyond the scope of this work to do more than mention it, the wisdom to be found in the traditional knowledge of our original nations and peoples provides one possible path and a means of achieving the much-needed transformative paradigm. But it is not merely for the sake of humans that we must shift away from the subdue and dominion mentality and behaviors traced to the Old Testament and ancient Christendom. We must also do for the sake of all living things, including Mother Earth and our future generations. As the original nations and peoples of Great Turtle Island, we must invite the world to walk with us on this beautiful path of life, in keeping with the central teaching of Indigenous law: respect the earth as our mother, and have a sacred regard for all living things. And to me, that is quite a beautiful sentiment, to have the grace to say, walk with us on this path, and within this framework of respecting both the earth and all living beings. And that is something that I think the concept of domination, that we have all been traumatized through our conditioning and our social circumstances at different levels, and not to say dominated in equal ways and equal measures, but we're all working our way out of this. So yeah, I guess we will. We have the bucket, and if anybody wants to take, we can also do some rose petals and dandelions. I'll circulate things around. These are slightly moldy, I will just say. If you have mold allergies, maybe don't take those. I've never really done this washing thing before, but I'm going to start. I will say this came out of the river. Anyone else who would like to put an intention is more than welcome, but I can't say much to the sanity of this particular sanitation of this particular water. It also has beautiful dandelions that Kat collected. So most of my dandelions are dry, but she had the wherewithal to think about putting some in the refrigerator. So we have.
I actually have to say they came from Carla.
Oh, Carla! Well, thank you, Carla. I originated from my sister-in-law. Well, see, so they're upstate. They're Haudenosaunee dandelions. See, so it's so great. Well, it's the gift economy that keeps on giving. So I'm gonna just come up here and leave this and put a little water on this threshold. Anybody else wants to, is more than welcome. And I think the revocation.
Time for us to go soon.
As we think about going over the Federal Reserve, the revocation is going to be for me, and it does have to be for you, but that we revoke the doctrine of domination. We do not consent to the human capital bond market. We do not consent to revoke our consent to 5 and 16 transhumanism. And now our goal is a world of reciprocity and love and abundance. Here we are. All right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'll just right on the threshold. Yeah. No, it's just water, so there's really nothing problematic about this. But so yes, we condemn commodification of human life. We revoke consent of the doctrine of domination. We revoke consent for human capital bond programs. We condemn blockchaining children, vulnerable populations, and smart city policing. And we reject transhumanism and the 5G telecoms. And want love and abundance, and we want healing and justice, and we want for all people's needs to be met and people to be heard, and for us to find our way and be good relative to all the other things in here. So that is my pitch. If anybody else, I don't know if anybody else is interested, but more than welcome to. And then if not, we'll go over to Federal Hall. And if you would like to leave some dandelions on either side, or little petals, do that as well. Oh, Julianne, do you want to put a little stage up here? Yeah, on the side maybe? And then we can, I was just doing the water on the...
Very nice. Thank you.
And so we're here at Louise Nevelson Park, and this is our last intervention. As you know, the three human capital bond markets are running through the central banks. Many of the central banks have programs tied to returning citizens, people who have been incarcerated because the prison industrial complex is a huge cost offset. There are a lot of partnerships around HUD and housing for returning citizens. Again, we want people to have stable, affordable housing, but it shouldn't be affordable, smart housing where they're turned into an impact data commodity. A lot of this is running through the San Francisco Federal Reserve specifically, and there's this guy, Ian Galloway, who's talking about it. And again, it intersects with the opportunity zones, which is this huge slush fund for giant global finance to pour their money into gentrifying out low-income communities. Every governor had to list like 20% of its low-income census tracts as opportunity zones, and then global finance could put its money, roll over capital gains into real estate and businesses in opportunity zones, but there's no protection around gentrification in those zones. They're just like, yeah, you gotta work that out with your local elected officials, right? There were no protections put in. And if the interests that put the money in hold it for 10 years, they never pay capital gains on the original capital gains, right? And these are people like Blackstone, BlackRock, these giant finance firms that have so much liquidity, they can easily hold on to something for 10 years. And so it's a way of like doing giant money laundering tied to the Fed. Now the other thing that the Fed is doing is stuff around skills building. You'll hear like the future of work, middle skills jobs, apprenticeships. Like really that means they want to put you in a virtual reality headset and a haptic suit. So you can compete to do remote work with people from all over the world for the lowest wage on blockchain and get sort of kind of crypto payments. I mean, that's what this future work is. And the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia, the head of it is Patrick Harker, who is former Wharton professor. He oversaw the creation of the Huntsman building for Wharton, which is the Huntsman family in Utah, which is a giant chemical company that's all into genomics and some biotech now. But Harker was also on the board of the Catholic Relief Services. So in Philadelphia, the predatory affordable housing impact investing space is actually being led through by something called Project Home, which is this Sister Mary Scullion. So it's actually coming out of the Vatican, and the Vatican just had they've had 3 impact investing conferences, and it's tied in with the Fed. So it's like the Vatican, the Fed, the global finance, and they're all framing this in progressive terms like, oh, we want the good kind of capitalism now that will give people a place to stay, and we'll train them for the global workforce and all this stuff. It's not what you think. It's not a good thing. So anyway, so we're here at the New York Fed because it is kind of like the Fed of the Feds, right? And all of the hedge funds are connected in here. When I was doing research around smart policing, domain awareness system, which was the integrated camera system put put into lower Manhattan after 9/11. Like that, Bloomberg worked on that with Microsoft, okay? And so then they franchised it. So any city that bought into the domain awareness system, like New York got a kickback from that, right? So they developed collaboratively this global, like smart policing system and then sold it out. But when they talked about it, there's an article about the domain awareness system, and they're like, well, there's the whole like nerve center of the system with all the screens, and they're like, oh, there's reserved chairs for special interests like the Federal Reserve, right? So the Federal Reserve is in on the smart policing. And then also, I would highly recommend, there's a book, when we're looking at Excelsior Pass being connected to IBM, many people are familiar with the Holocaust and the Hollerith cards. There are fewer people who are aware that IBM was the tech structure that underpinned the apartheid system, right? So we're talking about past systems and racialized past systems. We need to understand the apartheid just as much as the Holocaust, if not more. So there's a really good book. It's called Think Black by Clyde Ford, and his father was recruited by Watson himself to be the first black programmer at IBM, okay? And it's a memoir that's sort of his fraught relationship with his father of being a black man in corporate America, but not just any corporation, IBM specifically. So it turns out he followed his father into the business at IBM. And in this memoir, he actually talks about, for a time, his office for IBM being in the Federal Reserve building. So now these systems, we start to see how it becomes integrated, and the human capital markets are very much linked to the game. So we're going to walk around. It takes up a city walk. We're going to walk the block. We're going to scrub the thresholds, and when we stop, we're going to sing a bit of a song. I'm just going to repeat it for folks so we can remember. It's forget your perfect offering. Just ring the bells that you can ring. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And I have a little candle lamp right here. We're gonna carry, and then in between the singing, my friend Marianne, who has an amazing gong, we're going to sort of send up our transmutational signals to the Federal Reserve to sort of somehow transmute that. And then later, we're going to be doing a little labyrinth walk in this part to close out. The Federal Reserve in Philadelphia, the head of it is Patrick Harker, who is former Wharton professor. But Harker was also on the board of the Catholic Relief Services. So in Philadelphia, the predatory affordable housing impact investing space is actually being led through by something called Project Home, which is this Sister Mary Scullion. So it's actually coming out of the Vatican. And the Vatican just had they've had 3 impact investing conferences, and it's tied in with the Fed. So it's like the Vatican, the Fed, the global finance, and they're all framing this in progressive terms like, oh, we want the good kind of capitalism now that will give people a place to stay, and we'll train them for the global workforce and all this stuff. But it's not what you think. The New York Fed, because it is kind of like the Fed of the Feds, right? Like, and all of the hedge funds are connected in here. When I was doing research around smart policing, domain awareness system, which was the integrated camera system put into lower Manhattan after 9/11, like that, Bloomberg worked on that with Microsoft collaboratively, this global, like smart policing system, and then sold it out. But when they talked about it, there's an article about the domain awareness system, and they're like, well, there's the whole like nerve center of the system with all the screens, and they're like, oh, there's reserved chairs for special interests like the Federal Reserve, right? So the Federal Reserve is in on the smart policing. And then also, I would highly recommend, there's a book, when we're looking at Excelsior Pass being connected to IBM, many people are familiar with the Holocaust and the Hollerith cards. There are fewer people who are aware that IBM was the tech structure that underpinned the apartheid system, right? So we're talking about past systems and racialized past systems. We need to understand the apartheid just as much as the Holocaust, if not more. So there's a really good book. It's called Think Black by Clyde Ford, and his father was recruited by Watson himself to be the first black programmer at IBM, okay? And it's a memoir that's sort of his fraught relationship with his father of being a black man in corporate America, but not just any corporation, IBM specifically. So it turns out he followed his father into the business at IBM. And in this memoir, he actually talks about, for a time, his office for IBM being in the Federal Reserve building. So now these systems, we start to see how it becomes integrated, and the human capital markets are very much linked to it. I think if there's a symbol of domination, you look at that stonework, that's a pretty incredibly dominating system. And what's interesting is, I read that at Federal Hall that we were at, before this building was built, the gold and silver stores were actually stored in Federal Hall. So that was in the basement. That's where the gold was.
This is where the gold was, you said?
At Federal Hall, it was like the building we were at with George Washington. That was fortified, and that was. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Here, can you hold this for me? I'm gonna just. Where's the bucket? We have our bucket.
Bucket guy.
I'm gonna stay on the side
Right now.
We revoked the human capital bond market. We revoked. We do not consent to pay for success. We will not put children on blockchain. We will not blockchain food systems and control people's food access. We revoke consent to install vulnerable communities in smart housing. No pay for success. We say no to human capital bond market. We are putting our impressions for a better world of abundance outside this smart and optimized. We are not your robots. We're not your data commodities. Say no to
The New World Order.
go to the New World Order and Great Reset. Okay. Nick. Oh, I guess we should sing our song. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Forget your perfect offering. Forget your perfect offering. Just ring the bell that you can ring.
Just ring the bell that you can ring.
There is a crack in everything.
There is a crack in everything.
That's how the light gets in.
That's how the light gets in.
Forget your perfect offering.
Forget your perfect offering.
Just ring the bells that you can ring.
Just ring the bells that you can ring.
There is a crack in everything.
There is a crack in everything.
That's how the light gets in.
That's how the light gets in. Yay!
To call out your faux progressive bullshit.
To call out your faux progressive bullshit.
We're not going to be run by the central bankers.
We're not going to be
run
run
by
by
the
the central
central
bankers.
bankers.
We're not your biocomputers.
We're not your biocomputers.
We reject the New World Order.
We are not your human
Reject the New
capital.
World Order or the Great Reset. Okay. We reject pay for success finance.
We reject pay for success finance.
We reject human capital bond markets.
We reject human capital bond markets.
We reject blockchaining children, vulnerable people, and nature.
We reject blockchain.
Children,
Vulnerable
people in nature.
We reject the spatial web and surveillance panopticon.
We reject the spatial web and surveillance panopticon.
We reject the future of work that is run by robots.
We reject the future of work that is run by robots.
We reject the future of work where people are pitted against each other by AI.
We
reject the future where people are
pitted against each other. Against AI. Yeah. Right on.
We reject the privatization of the social safety net.
We reject the privatization of the social safety net.
Allison, let's transmute it.
Oh, how do we do that?
We just say transmute instead of reject.
Okay. Transmute.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We're gonna try to make love.
Transmute. How do we do? You tell me.
Just say it. Just say it. We
Transmute.
transmute. That's it.
Transmute. Okay.
Instead of reject, just say transmute at the thing.
So we don't say reject.
Like
Okay.
instead.
Okay.
Only if you agree.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm learning all these things. Okay. Stable housing for people.
Stable housing
for
for
people.
Transmute.
Transmute.
Doctrine of domination.
Transmute.
Transmute.
The doctrine of domination.
AI settler colonialism.
Yes.
Transmute.
AI settler colonialism. Yes.
And what is the
Collective trauma.
Transmute collective trauma.
Manufactured poverty and harm.
Oh, yeah.
Manufactured
Transmute.
Transmute. Yes.
I don't want to touch the building because that'll make sure we get that thing.
Transformation.
Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Transmute. What does one transmute that? We're gonna need more sage. I'll point out for the live that this is on Liberty Street. Interesting connection there. I think it's actually 33 Liberty Street.
Oh, that
Numerically,
sounds
you guys might have understanding better than me of what 33 Liberty Street is.
It is 33.
5 stories below street level. Subterranean vaults. 5 stories below street level. I did a good tour here.
All of our social credit scores have dropped precipitously. All this walking tour of global finance. Again, just to reiterate, these beautiful dandelions came from upstate, and they are our freshest dandelions of the day. Most powerful and potent, so we will leave them at the entrance here. Alright, so we have our little bit of water, again, from the hunter there from upstate New York. And, I had a friend, someone who was here who talked about saving the water upstate from the fracking. And so now what we're talking about is really literally fracking people, right? Fracking children, breaking their souls, breaking their spirits, and then feeding them to not just global finance, because it's about the money, but these people have more money than they could ever use. It's actually about transhumanism. It's about using their technological systems to train, to harvest our emotion, to harvest our soul, to harvest our spirits into these machines. And I would really ask that people spend some time looking into what Cardano is doing in Ethiopia. It's the largest digital identity blockchain deployment, 5 million students and teachers. And they hope to get everybody in Ethiopia on blockchain and take over the continent of Africa. The goal is that they want to build the spatial web, and they want to use the children of the global south to do it, really. And to use virtual reality education, I think literally to harvest their biometrics and their emotional states, to train, because they're working with OpenCog, which is Ben Gertz's lab that made the humanoid robots. So literally, very likely UNICEF is backing virtual reality education all over Africa, India, and Chile, and saying those kids are never going to get human teachers or schools, but we'll give them virtual reality, and that's what's being done. And that's part of the human capital bond market, and that's linked to these paper success deals that are central banking, but beyond, they're global banking. And we did our first revocation at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they have a Center for Universal Education. And really, that education is merely about data harvest at this point, for very, very dark, occulted forces. So this is our last little bit. So we say that human capital bond market, paper success finance, blockchain identity, transmute. We revoke consent, not in our name. Spatial web panopticon, virtual reality soul killing, AI gig employment, transmute. Federal Reserve, you do not have our consent to turn the world into a computer for your hedge funds. Last round of song.
Okay.
Forget your perfect offering. Forget your perfect offering. Let's ring the bells that you can ring. Let's ring the bells that you can ring. There is a crack in everything. There is a crack in everything. offering. Just ring the bells that you can ring.
Just ring the bells that you can ring.
There is a crack in everything.
There is a crack in everything.
That's how the light gets in.
That's how the light gets in.
Forget your perfect offering.
Forget your perfect offering.
Just ring the bells that you can ring.
Just ring the bells that you can ring.
There is a crack in everything.
There is a crack in everything.
That's how the light gets in.
That's how the light gets in.
And as Marianne said, that's how the dandelions grow.
That's how the dandelions grow.
The cracks. We're making cracks. There are powerful things making cracks. So you guys want to head over to
There's
So
lots of add-ons.
we finished. People have been troopers to stay with us for hours and hours. We just finished at the Federal Reserve. We're here in Louise Middleton Park, and we made a little labyrinth in the gravel here, and we collected mustard seed, and we had this beautiful sentiment from Nathan, I think it was, that said, children's growth is guided by love. Thirst for power and control has no jurisdiction here. And Kat, maybe you could just sweep up to the Federal Reserve, like how crazy that building is. So we took our mustard seed, faith like a mustard seed, and I just want to speak to, people have given me so many gifts around this dandelion summer so far, and I'm so grateful. And so one of them is actually, was this dandelion honey. And this came from a generous donor in North Georgia, I believe, and they actually are beekeepers and made this honey. And so we shared the honey with this bread. Earlier we had used some of the bread in sort of a prayerful ceremony we did acknowledging the ancestors at the ancestral burial ground. So this is kind of closing out our day. And I read that you can sort of set an intention with this honey pot. So I have a dill pickle jar, but I always love the shape of these jars. And in here we have some dandelions, some rose petals. My friend Julie's pendulum broke, and so she has some of the crystal is in here.
Oh, wow.
And I have some sage from Cheyenne River Reservation and a bit of mica, which is about caring for being able to see the beauty in humanity despite its imperfections. And so I put the Ho'oponopono prayer in, and then we also, you can see it sort of stuffed through now with all sorts of good intentions. When we walk to the labyrinth, we walk to the middle, revoking or transmuting all of the things of the Federal Reserve's Human Capital Bond Program, and then we walked out with the affirmations of the world that we wanted, worlds of abundance and love and reciprocity and care. And so we put those in there. And so now I'm just gonna put some of this honey. Actually, I might just pour some of this honey on. It's really good, amazing honey. And actually, so Julie also brought some dandelion tea and ginger. So we've been sharing that because in this struggle, it's important to eat together and to join together. And so this week we shared some of the tea here, and as we were singing, it was with this light. So you guys know I'm terrible with the lighting systems, but I'm gonna try. They said something about a candle on this, so I bought some beeswax candles, and I'm not gonna burn this all the way down, but I'll at least put a candle on it. So, Marianne, can we do the peace thing again? Sure. So Marianne has taught us this, the universal
greeting of peace.
The universal greeting of peace. So we'll put this over our intention.
Yes.
I offer you peace. I offer you friendship. I offer you love. I hear your needs.
I see your beauty.
I see your beauty.
I feel your feelings.
I feel your feelings.
All wisdom comes from above.
All wisdom comes from above.
And I honor that wisdom in you. Let us work together.
Let us
work together.
I am another you.
I am another you.
You are another me.
You are another me.
We are one.
We are one.
So be it.
So be it, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Allison.
Transmute!
Transmute!
Reserve!
Transmute!